The elevator doors whispered open on the 42nd floor, and Clara Bennett stepped into a world of polished marble and floor-to-ceiling windows. Her reflection stared back at her from every gleaming surface, a young woman in a plain gray uniform carrying a supply caddy that felt heavier than it should. She had cleaned offices, hotels, and private homes before, but never a penthouse like this one. Never a space that felt less like a home and more like a beautiful museum where someone had forgotten to live. First impressions, the agency supervisor had been clear during the briefing. Thomas Ashford was a private man, founder of Horizon Technologies, worth more money than Clara could imagine in 10 lifetimes. He required evening cleaning services 3 times per week between 7 and midnight. He preferred minimal interaction, valued discretion above all else, and paid exceptionally well. What the supervisor hadn't mentioned was the overwhelming emptiness that seemed to echo through every pristine room. Clara moved through the living spaces methodically, dusting surfaces that barely needed dusting, arranging throw pillows that no one ever disturbed. Everything was perfect and untouched. It's like a photograph of a life rather than a life itself. The discovery it was nearly 10 o'clock when Clara finished the main living area and moved toward the back hallway. She had been instructed to avoid the east wing where the bedrooms were located, but as she passed a partially open door, something made her pause. Light spilled from the crack, warm and golden, so different from the cold white LED lighting throughout the rest of the penthouse. And then she heard it, the soft sound of a brush against canvas, rhythmic and meditative. Clara knew she should continue walking, should respect the privacy she had been hired to maintain, but curiosity pulled at her like a tide. She stepped closer, careful to keep her footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. The artist in shadow through the narrow opening, she could see into what appeared to be an art studio. Canvases lined the walls, some finished, most abandoned halfway through. And there, standing before an easel with his back to the door, was Thomas Ashford. He looked different from the stern photograph she had seen in the agency file. His dark hair was disheveled, his white shirt rolled to the elbows and stained with paint. But it was his posture that struck her most, shoulders curved inward, like he was trying to make himself smaller, like he was carrying a weight that pressed down on him with every breath, unfinished. Traits Clara's eyes moved from the man to the canvas he was working on. A woman's face emerged from layers of oil paint, beautiful and delicate, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. But the portrait was incomplete. The background remained raw canvas, the edges of her figure rough and undefined. It was the same with every painting Clara could see from her limited vantage point. The same woman, captured in different poses and expressions, but never finished. Always stopped at some invisible barrier that Thomas could not cross. Shared grief she watched as he lifted his brush, hovering it over the canvas as if the next stroke might shatter something fragile. His hand trembled slightly, and then he lowered the brush without making contact. Clara felt something crack open inside her chest, a recognition of pain she knew too well. She had lost her parents in a car accident 5 years ago, had spent countless nights staring at their photographs, unable to move forward but unable to let go. She understood what it meant to be haunted by love. The moment of almost discovery, Clara. It must have shifted her weight, because the floorboard beneath her foot released a soft creak. Thomas's hand froze mid-air, his entire body going still like a deer sensing danger. She held her breath, certain he would turn around, certain she would be caught invading this private moment of grief. But he didn't turn. Instead, he slowly lowered the brush to the nearby table and stood there in silence, head slightly tilted as if listening to the empty air. The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with unspoken awareness. The retreat Clara carefully stepped backward, heart hammering against her ribs. She moved down the hallway as quietly as she had come, returning to the safety of the kitchen where she was supposed to be. Her hands shook slightly as she organized cleaning supplies, though whether from fear of being caught or from the emotional weight of what she had witnessed, she couldn't quite say. She finished her duties quickly after that, but her mind remained in that studio, replaying the image of a man trapped between memory and letting go. The decision as Clara rode the elevator down 42 floors that night, she stared at her reflection in the polished metal doors. She should forget what she saw, should maintain professional distance, should focus on doing her job and collecting her paycheck. Her younger sister Jamie was in college, and the tuition payments were constant pressure. Clara couldn't afford to lose this position over misplaced curiosity or emotional involvement. But even as she thought these practical thoughts, she knew she would return. Not just to clean the penthouse, but to stand in that hallway again. To bear witness to Thomas Ashford's private grief, even if he never knew she was there. The pull of connection that night. Lying in her small apartment across the city, Clara couldn't sleep. She kept seeing those unfinished paintings, kept feeling the weight of another person's sorrow mixing with her own. Perhaps it was foolish to feel connected to a stranger, to a wealthy man who lived in a different universe from her own. Was the great equalizer, and in that moment, when Thomas had stood frozen with his brush hovering over canvas, Clara had recognized something profoundly human. Something that whispered that both of them were still searching for a way back to the living. 3 nights passed, and Clara returned to the penthouse each time with a mixture of anticipation and guilt weighing on her conscience. She told herself she was simply doing her job, but the truth hummed beneath every task she completed. She cleaned faster now, worked more efficiently, all so she could find herself in that hallway again by 10 o'clock. And each night, like a ritual neither of them acknowledged, Thomas would be in his studio, standing before another unfinished portrait of the woman Clara now understood must have been someone he loved deeply. The pattern never changed. He would paint for 20 minutes, maybe 30, adding careful strokes to the face, the eyes, the curve of a smile. And then he would reach the same invisible wall, the same moment where his hand would freeze and the brush would lower without completing what his heart could not finish. The night of invitation on Thursday evening, Clara arrived to find the studio door open wider than usual, not just cracked, but deliberately ajar, as if inviting her to cross a threshold she had only observed from a distance. She hesitated in the hallway, cleaning supplies forgotten, on the counter behind her. The golden light spilled out into the corridor, and this time she could hear something new in addition to the brushstrokes. Thomas was humming quietly, a melody that sounded both beautiful and broken at the same time. She stood there, frozen. Between retreat and advance, when his voice cut through the silence, calm and resigned. "You can come in if you want. I know you have been standing there all week." First words, Clara felt heat rush to her cheeks as embarrassment and surprise collided in her chest. She stepped forward slowly, appearing in the doorway like a ghost finally made solid. Thomas stood at his easel, but this time he was facing her direction, his expression unreadable except for a weariness that seemed carved into the lines around his eyes. He looked younger than she expected, perhaps mid-30s, with the kind a face that might have been cheerful once, but now carried the permanent shadow of loss. "I apologize," Clara said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not mean to intrude on your privacy. Should have walked past, but the light and the sound of painting, it just pulled me here." Thomas studied her for a long moment, then gestured to a worn leather chair in the corner. "Sit if you want, or stand. Either way, you are already here, so you might as well stop hiding in hallways." The conversation begins. Clara moved cautiously into the room, her eyes sweeping across the canvases that lined the walls. Up close, they were even more heartbreaking. Each one captured the same woman in different moments. Laughing, reading, gazing out a window, always beautiful, always incomplete. "They are all her," Thomas said, following Clara's gaze. "My wife, Sophie. She passed 2 years ago from an illness that moved faster than any of us could comprehend." He set his brush down and wiped his hands on a paint-stained cloth. "I started painting again after she died because it was the only thing that made me feel close to her. We used to paint together on weekends, terrible amateur stuff mostly, but it was ours." His voice caught slightly on the last word. Clara sat down in the leather chair, her hands folded in her lap. "I lost my parents 5 years ago," she said softly. "Car accident. One moment they were driving to a family dinner, and the next moment they were gone. I understand what it feels like when the world keeps moving, but you are stuck in the moment. Everything changed." Thomas looked at her with new attention, really seeing her for the first time. "How did you move forward?" he asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice, as if he was asking for a map through territory he could not navigate alone. Clara smiled sadly. I am not sure I have moved forward. I think I just learned to carry it differently. The grief does not get smaller, but somehow you get stronger at holding it. Dreams set aside, Thomas returned to his easel, picking up the brush again, but not painting, just holding it like a talisman. What do you do when you are not cleaning penthouses? He asked, and Clara was surprised by the personal question. She hesitated before answering. I work 2 jobs, actually. The cleaning agency and weekend shifts at a cafe. My younger sister is in college, studying education, and I help with her expenses. She paused, debating whether to share more, then decided honesty felt right in this strange confessional space. I wanted to be an art teacher once. I had a scholarship offer to a teaching program. But when my parents died, someone needed to keep things stable for Jamie, so I put that dream away and picked up practical work instead. Understanding. Through Artemis set the brush down and walked to a shelf where sketchbooks were stacked. He pulled one out and flipped through pages filled with architectural drawings, landscape studies, and figure sketches. Sophie was the real artist between us, he said. She could capture emotion in a single line while I struggled to make things look technically correct. She used to tell me I thought too much and felt too little when I painted. He closed the sketchbook and looked at Clara directly. She would have liked you. She always believed people who sacrificed for others had the strongest hearts. The compliment caught Clara off guard, and she felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes. The confession. Clara stood and moved closer to the current canvas, studying the unfinished portrait with new understanding. Why do you stop? She asked gently. Every night I have watched you paint beautifully, and then you reach this point where you cannot continue. What happens in that moment? Thomas exhaled slowly, a sound full of pain held too long. If I finish the painting, it becomes a thing separate from me. It becomes art that other people can look at and judge and discuss. But if I leave it unfinished, it stays mine. It stays connected to her, to us, to the private world we built together. He rubbed his face with both hands. I know it sounds irrational, but completing these portraits feels like letting her go completely. And I cannot do that. A new perspective. Clara understood the fear beneath his words, but she also recognized the cage it created. She spoke carefully, choosing words that came from her own journey through grief. When my parents died, I kept their bedroom exactly as they left it for almost 2 years. I thought changing anything would mean forgetting them, erasing their existence. But one day my sister said something that shifted everything. She said memory does not live in objects or frozen moments. Memory lives in us and how we carry forward the love we received. She moved to stand beside Thomas, both of them looking at the unfinished portrait. Maybe finishing the painting does not mean letting Sophie go. Maybe it means honoring what she gave you by allowing it to become something complete and beautiful. The request. Thomas was quiet for a long time, and Clara worried she had overstepped, had pushed too hard into wounds that were not hers to heal. But then he turned to her with an expression that held something fragile and hopeful. Would you come back tomorrow night? He asked. Not to clean, but to sit here while I paint. I do not need you to talk or do anything particular. I just need to not be alone in this room with all these ghosts. The request was so vulnerable, so human, that Clara felt something shift in her own carefully guarded heart. She nodded slowly. Yes, I can do that. The promises. Clara gathered her things to leave that night. Thomas walked her to the elevator. They stood in the marble foyer, and for a moment, they were just 2 people who had found an unexpected understanding and shared sorrow. Thank you for not treating me like I am broken, Thomas said quietly. Everyone else either tiptoes around me or tries to fix me. You just saw me, Clara smiled, a real smile that felt strange on her face after so much careful professionalism. Maybe we recognize each other because we are both still finding our way back? The elevator arrived, but before she stepped inside, Thomas spoke once more. Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, I will order dinner for 2. It was not a command, but an invitation. And Claire accepted it with a simple nod before the doors closed between them. New territory riding down through 42 floors. Clara pressed her hand against her chest, where her heart was beating faster than it should. She had come to this job expecting to clean and leave, to maintain the invisible boundary between servant and employer. But something had shifted tonight, something that felt both dangerous and necessary. She was stepping into new territory, into a connection that defied the simple categories she had built her life around. And despite every practical voice in her head warning her to be careful, to protect herself, Clara knew she would return tomorrow night. Not because she had to, but because two broken people had found a moment of recognition in each other. And sometimes that was enough to make you brave. Clara arrived at 7 o'clock the next evening wearing her own clothes instead of the gray uniform. A simple navy dress that felt strange after weeks of professional distance. Thomas met her at the door with takeout containers from an Italian restaurant, and they ate in comfortable silence at the kitchen counter. Two people learning how to exist in each other's presence without performance or pretense. After dinner, they moved to the studio together, and this time, Clara did not hover in doorways or ask permission. She settled into the leather chair while Thomas stood at his easel, and for the first hour, neither of them spoke. The quiet felt sacred rather than awkward, filled with the sound of brush against canvas and the distant hum of the city below. Small changes over the following weeks. The pattern repeated and deepened. Clara came 3 evenings each week, sometimes 4, and gradually the studio began to change. Thomas still painted portraits of Sophie, but now he completed them. The first finished painting showed her sitting in a garden, surrounded by flowers, her smile captured fully and beautifully. When Thomas stepped back from the completed work, Clara saw tears on his face, but they were not only tears of grief. There was something else mixed in, something that looked almost like relief. "She would want me to finish," he said quietly. "She would want these paintings to exist in the world, not stay trapped in my fear." Clara stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "It is beautiful, Thomas. You honored her memory perfectly." Expanding horizons after that first completion, something shifted in Thomas's artistic approach. He began painting other subjects, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. City landscapes appeared on his canvases, the Manhattan skyline at sunset, the park in autumn, the rain-streaked streets at midnight. Abstract pieces emerged, swirls of color that seemed to represent emotions he could not name. And one evening, Clara arrived to find him painting something entirely unexpected. A portrait of her sitting in the leather chair, sketching in a notebook she did not yet own. "You look horrified," Thomas said with a slight smile. "I am not used to being seen that way," Clara admitted, staring at the canvas where her own face looked back at her. Thoughtful and serene, rediscovering lost dreams, Thomas set down his brush and retrieved something from a cabinet. A leather-bound sketchbook with blank pages and a set of professional pencils. He held them out to Clara like an offering. "You told me you wanted to be an art teacher once. Maybe it is time to remember what that felt like." Clara took the sketchbook with trembling hands, running her fingers over the smooth cover. "I have not drawn anything in 5 years. I do not know if I still can." Thomas returned to his easel. "Then find out. Sit here with me and remember who you were before grief told you to forget." So Clara opened the sketchbook and began to draw, hesitant lines at first, then bolder strokes as muscle memory awakened in her fingers. She sketched the studio, the canvases, the view from the window, and finally, when she felt brave enough, she sketched Thomas painting, capturing the concentration on his face and the grace in his movements. 6 weeks into their evening ritual, Thomas invited Clara to dinner at a proper restaurant rather than take out in the kitchen. They sat across from each other at a quiet corner table, and Clara noticed how different he looked from the haunted man she had first observed through a cracked door. There was color in his face now, lightness in his gestures. Halfway through the meal, Thomas set down his fork and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "I need to tell you something, and I hope you will not be angry." Clara felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "What is it?" Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table. "I made some calls a few weeks ago. Your sister Jamie's college tuition for this semester and the next 3 semesters has been paid in full. Her student loans have been cleared. The overwhelming gift. Clara stared at the envelope, then at Thomas, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. You paid for Jamie's education? Thomas, that is too much. I cannot accept that. I cannot accept charity. Her voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby tables. Thomas remained calm, his eyes steady on hers. It is not charity, Clara. Let me explain before you refuse. He leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. You have given me something I thought I would never have again. You gave me companionship without demands, understanding without judgment. You sat with me while I learned how to finish what I started. That gift is beyond price. Clara shook her head, overwhelmed. Sitting in a chair is not worth tens of thousands of dollars in tuition. Thomas smiled gently. You did more than sit in a chair. You reminded me that life continues, that creation still matters, that I could honor Sophie by living fully rather than staying frozen in grief. The proposal. Thomas retrieved another envelope, this one thicker than the first. I have a second proposal, and this one is professional rather than personal. I am founding a community art center in Brooklyn, a place where people from all backgrounds can learn painting, sculpture, music, all forms of creative expression. I need someone to run it, someone who understands both the technical aspects of art and the healing power it provides. I want you to be the director. Clara felt lightheaded, unable to process the magnitude of what he was offering. Thomas, I am a maid. I clean apartments. I have no credentials for running an art center. He shook his head firmly. You are not just a maid. You are someone who sacrificed your own dreams to support your sister. You are someone who sees art as transformation rather than decoration. You are exactly who I need for this position. Understanding the truth, Clara pressed her hands flat on the table, trying to ground herself in reality. Why are you really doing this? Is this about guilt or obligation, or something else? Thomas reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. It is about partnership. I have resources, but I lost my sense of purpose when Sophie died. You have purpose, but lack resources. Together, we could create something meaningful, something that helps other people find their way back to themselves through art. He paused, his voice softening. And if I am being completely honest, it is also because somewhere in these past weeks, you became the first person I wanted to share my future with, not romantically necessarily, but as someone I trust to build something beautiful alongside me. The healing recognition. Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes as the truth settled around her like gentle snow. They had been healing each other all along, two wounded people who had stumbled into an unexpected connection. She thought about Jamie, who could now finish college without the crushing weight of debt. She thought about the community art center filled with people discovering their creative voices. She thought about herself standing in a studio again, not as an observer, but as a participant in something larger than survival. I am terrified, she admitted honestly. Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. So am I, but maybe being terrified together is better than being safe and alone. Standing together, they returned to the penthouse that night. But instead of separating into their usual positions, they stood before a fresh canvas together. Thomas handed Clara a brush, and she took it with shaking fingers. What should we paint? She asked. Thomas considered the blank white surface, then smiled, the first truly joyful smile Clara had seen from him. A sunrise. Something that represents beginning rather than ending, as they painted together. Their brushes creating strokes that sometimes harmonized and sometimes clashed, building an image of dawn breaking over the city they both called home. Gold and pink and orange spread across the canvas, light pushing back darkness, warmth promising another day. The completion as they added the final touches. Clara realized this was the first painting Thomas had completed in 2 years that was not about grief. It was about hope, about the courage to start again, about two people finding each other in the shadows and choosing to step into the light together. Thomas set down his brush and looked at Clara with gratitude and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name. Thank you for seeing me, he said simply. Clara smiled, her heart full of possibility for the first time in years. Thank you for teaching me I could still create. They stood before the finished sunrise, two artists who had rediscovered their purpose. two broken people who had helped each other become whole again. And in that moment, surrounded by paintings of the past and dreams of the future, they both understood that healing was not about forgetting. It was about having the courage to begin again.